Yeah.
That also doesn't detract from the validity of the definition, whether I thought about it for a year.
No, it doesn't detract from the validity of the definition. But if we're all making our own definitions here,
Sure.
no discussion can progress. Because if I say,
Sure.
what's a
But
tall man?
neither can it-
If I say,
neither can it
what's a
progress
tall,
if we just,
what's
you
a
know-
tall man? I'll say someone who's 6 foot. He says no, it's 6'1". He says no, someone's 6'2". And he says 7 foot. Then I become short.
Sure.
In the conception of him. But tall in the, so the point is, we have to work with definitions which are either available and argued in the literature.
No, in law, it's how it's
That's
operated in
that's
law.
fine as well. If you want to take,
That's the bottom line. That's where the rubber hits the road. In law, that's where freedom falls or
but what's your name?
Bill.
Bill. Look, that's a good approach. But what I want to put to you is that you mentioned America and Britain, right? So in America, the founding fathers of America, when they had the original documents like the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, the Federalist Papers, and so on and so forth, they based their legal definitions, their constitutional definitions, on number one, philosophical definitions of John Locke and other people. Number two, of pre-existing English precedent law. So, for example, the definitions of freedom of speech, expression, etc. A lot of it was actually taken from English law. And English law, a lot of it was influenced by philosophy. So we're going to end up having that philosophical discussion either way. Right, there you have it. Yeah.
But they have to make these philosophical ideas work on a day-to-day basis.
They try to, yeah.
No, that's what they try to do. You were talking about self-harm. You know, you can't ask me, you can't ask this gentleman here to murder me because that's an incitement to violence.
But if he
that's
was
against the law.
Brilliant.
Right. I can't go into a theatre and cry fire because it'll cause a panic and people are hurt. That's the idea
you're right.
talking about.
If he was a military,
hold
on. But let me tell you something.
It works with the law.
What's your Bill? Can I tell you something? Right. Sorry. You said that he can't tell this guy to kill you, right? Yeah. But if he was a military commander and he was a soldier, he could, right? And the liberal law would allow that. If he was a parole, if he was some kind of working in the judiciary, and you are an executor in one of the states that allows execution, and then you would be killed, right? So it depends on who he is, and what the law says. So it's not always the case. Look, this is my point. When social liberalism comes into a practical application, you have certain things that would be allowed by law that would, on the face of it, be against human rights itself.
But there's always those exceptions.
For example, let me give you. No, they're not exceptions.
They call it God in the gaps. There are always those exceptions.
Can I? With all due respect, let me explain to you why I think that basically liberalism is a self-contradiction, or it allows for contradictions to take place within it. There's two competing themes in liberalism. Okay, there's two competing themes. On the one hand, it's almost unanimously understood in contractarian liberalism that if you have a sovereign, that sovereign has the ability to make laws. Those laws must be obeyed. And the subordinate or the subjects have to obey those laws. Like me and you have to obey the laws of the land. In this country, Parliament is sovereign. Okay, Parliament, that is the constitutional paradigm.
The people.
No. Parliament is Parliament.
Right.
Now, how does Parliament get its legitimacy? Parliament gets its legitimacy not only through voting, but it has its legitimacy intact. If we did not vote, Parliament would still be sovereign. That's the reality. When I was born, and for example, when I was about 18 years old, which was a good 10 years ago now, yeah?
Oh, yes. Yeah, and the rest. You've got to go.
No. Actually, it's 10 years ago. It doesn't believe. All right. No, 10 years ago, when I was 18, yeah, I could vote. See, now he's thinking, yeah, no one believes it. But look, 10 years.
Sorry.
I'm actually 27, by the way. Yeah.
I didn't mean that.
No, that's right. So 11 years ago, when I was 18 years old, I didn't vote, right? But I still had to obey the rules of the land. Isn't it correct? If I did something wrong, I might go to prison.
Sure.
Even if I don't vote, I still have to obey the laws of the land.
Sure.
And you know, that's justified on liberalism because there's a social contract theory which suggests that, look, if you come on the earth and you're in a certain place, they provide the military thing, their tax and so on, and therefore the system is that has, even Nozick says
maintain
that.
All
yeah, even Nozick says that. You know, he's a minimalist, he's a libertarian, he says that. So the point is this, is that what if now the sovereign authority says we should have a death penalty, okay? Like in America, there's a death penalty. And the reason why they're applying that death penalty is because the person is a traitor or he's doing treason or something. On social contract theory, there's no problem with that on liberalism.
Sure, but then you would look, and you
Do
would
you see
step,
that?
yeah, but you would step away out of the, like, just look, one
Can I just answer to that? So you see, the point is that human rights are an outgrowth of liberalism. If I say I want to have the freedom to say and do whatever I want, okay? He just mentioned two great examples. If I went to a thing and said fire, or nowadays if I go to I say Allahu Akbar or something like that, then someone could arrest me, and someone will say maybe that's justified, Sorry, the camera's on.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry. He's come with his weapons. Look, you see, if a man and woman, husband and wife, come now and have intercourse on this floor right in front of us, and those policemen over there come and arrest them and say this is a public display of whatever it is, yeah? We're going to put you in the back of the van. John Stuart Mill says that's fine because we have certain sensibilities. You shouldn't do whatever you want. There's children around and so on.
Sure.
So that is a contradiction, because if freedom is the best thing, to what extent can freedom operate?
These laws are decided by the people. You went back to like execution, public execution.
Yeah.
The reason why, if you go across America, not every state has execution. There's some states that don't have the death penalty. The reason for that is that in places like Texas, they decided we're going to bring back the death penalty. In other states, I think
they had it from the beginning.
They said no. It's the people who decide.
All right, perfect. So I've got a good question for you then. Can I ask him a question? Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Say if you have 100% of the electorate say we should have a death penalty for the blasphemer. They do a referendum and they say, look, whoever curses Jesus should be killed. 100%, not even 99%. Theoretical situation. The people are deciding that. Should that be enacted?
No.
You're saying no. What do you say?
Oh.
Oh yeah. You see, look, contradiction. You see,
contradiction is part of any system that allows for freedom of choice.
No, not really, actually. Well,
Look, and one more thing before you continue. You mentioned before.
But going back before you make that statement,
Sure.
You said contradiction is part of any system that allows freedom of choice. Freedom of choice is not even defined at the moment yet. We have still not to pass that hurdle, because he's saying the people should have a right to kill you, and he hasn't decided yet. But you're saying no, they shouldn't. But what is stronger, democracy or liberalism then? Is social liberalism stronger, or is it democratic?
Sure.
So is my right to vote more important, or is his right, or is my right to have my life in these circumstances more important?
You're comparing the right to vote to a right to life.
Yeah, of course, because look,
there is no right to vote if there is no life. So categorically,
if you don't believe in the right to killing people, then you would outlaw war, wouldn't you?
yes,
All right, so you're a pacifist.
yes.
All right, so this is the problem. That view of pacifism is incompatible with social liberalism.
Again, why are you before we just
Because someone will argue. Sorry, sir. I apologize. I keep interrupting. I will say this and just. Someone could argue you're living in a utopia, right? You think that you can live in a world where people will not attack each other and you can't kill someone, and at the same time, people can live a free life. Someone will argue the only reason why we have freedom, in fact, liberals will argue, Americans will argue, the only reasons why we have this freedom what we have is because our forefathers died in World War II, which is war, which is killing, right?
Yes.
So killing is justified in some context.
Yes, I agree.
But you said you're a pacifist.
Look, just because I'm against killing does not mean that there is not a circumstance under which I would defend myself or defend someone else. In the same sense that, for instance, you might be against public defecation, but let's say I have a stomach virus and I'm just like...
You put on in, man. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
And I'm bursting at the seams. I might give way, if you know what I mean. So, absolutely. Look, I think that a lot of these arguments boil down to an argument of futility. Absolutely, yes. You cannot implement all laws. Absolutely, right? There's always going to be extenuating circumstances to things. You always need to take things into consideration. And one thing before that you mentioned that we need to use definitions of pre-existing pre-existing definitions that have been discussed in literature. I actually agree with you. I think that economic rigor, the sort of academic rigor in any debate or discussion is extremely, however, it's also extremely limiting. if you want to further an idea based exclusively on previous work without any introduction, you know, you're trying to make a hybrid that is like almost impossible. This chimera of an idea.
You know, your point there is well taken. I accept that point. In fact, Ibn Taymiyyah, who is one of the scholars of Islam, he wrote a book called Al-Radd al-Mantiqiyin. In the beginning, which means the response to the logicians. He said the first thing is you'll never find a definition which is all-encompassing.
Yep.
He says there's always a problem. Yeah. So he says that, but what you have to do, I mean, people of their own specialism know, like medical doctors know what they mean when they say X or Y or Z. They know what it is. You don't have to stress it too much.
Generally accepted.
Yeah, but an all-encompassing definition doesn't exist in the real world, is what his point is.
So what does he suggest? What's his solution to that?
He's saying that, well, to be honest with you, he seems to suggest that let's go back to what the people of that particular specialism say. For example, doctors, if we had this discussion, if it became too abstract, doctors wouldn't be able to do their work.
No.
Yeah, so he says that let them kind of come to an agreement on what things mean, peer review, and let that work, let that process work itself. It's never, and he admits it's never going to be a perfect system.
But isn't that what happens here now today?
It is.
Yeah.
It's the academic process.
Yeah.
But also in medicine as well.
Yes,
Also in
yes,
medicine. And,
yes.
you know, they'll decide what you know, like let's.
What should we define? Yeah.
You know,
You're right.
does life end and stuff.
Absolutely. So here's what I'll say to you though. Here's the biggest one of the biggest problems of liberalism. One of the things that is assumed is that you're living. This is Nozick's argument. He says, look. He says he doesn't believe in a social contract. By the way, he's one of the non-contractarian liberals, non-contractual / contractarian liberals. He says this. He says that originally you have perfect freedom, okay? And then what happens is the state takes more and more of your rights away through taxation, through manipulation, through punishment, and so on and so forth. And so what he proposes is something called a minimal state. Nozick starts with an assumption.
Right.
He says, look, he actually has a passage in his book that he says that if you have these people who want to get married, and these people want to get married, let's say, for example, you want to get married, and there are three, let's say you want to get married to women, yeah? And there's 3 other guys that want to also get married to women. Now these 3 other guys want to get married to, I'm sure he's smiling. No, he's married already. He's saying, I'm not going to get involved, I'm not going to make this, I know he does. These guys want to get married, all right? Now, if these guys get married to the woman that you would have otherwise married, is that limiting of your option or not?
Well, it's up to her then, isn't it?
No, I'm not saying...
You're asking if that's a limitation of mine.
Yes,
but that's a natural limitation.
Yeah, that's what he says as well. But he says that's an acceptable limitation. So look, let me say this one more time. You 3 want to get married. There are 3 girls to pubescent, legal, just because I say girls, people will have the wrong idea, that want to get married. Now these 3 men get married to those 3 girls that you want to get married to, right? If that happens, then your freedom is limited.
Sure.
You see here the problem is this, if you don't have a government and you don't have an imposition from a sovereign, yes, yeah, that is taking your freedom away. When I go to the end of the month and I get my paycheck and there's money taken out from taxes, that's taking my freedom away, right? But at the same time, if you had a chaotic or anarchic state, that would be freedom limiting as well, because...
There would be no marriages? Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm saying there will be marriages, but everyone's freedom is still limited by other people. So you have a choice. Your freedom can either be limited by other people or the government. Or the government.
Yeah, it can be mediated or anarchic.
Right, so what we're saying is, if we agree that the freedom can and ought to be limited, it's justifiable, even from a utility perspective. Justifiably limited by the government. Now the question is to what extent? So,
sure, always the question.
No, right. So if you say, look, it should be to a minimal extent, where it's closest to that original state, then what will happen is, like for example, if we don't have a death penalty for a murderer, yeah, if let's be honest, if you have death penalty for murder, there will be less murders.
Not necessarily.
No, let me explain. Theoretically, you'd assume it's a deterrent, there will be less murders. Let's just say for the sake of argument, if all things stay the same. However, if there's no death penalty, there will be more murders in a sense. Because if you cared about human life, you've got 2 choices. Either we kill these guys, who are the perpetrators, or we'll allow these deaths to happen, which will be done.
Imprison them and you've solved the problem without killing people.
Right, no problem. Yes, that can be something as well.
Deterrence, is that what you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, so punishment from the state. Punishment. Imagine if there was no jails. Forget about the death penalty thing. If there's no jails, right? If there was no jails, everyone will do whatever they want. Especially here in Speaker's Corner.
Again, no.
Well, a lot of people will do whatever they want. If there was no fear of consequence, right?
Look, we had...
Maybe you're a good man, but I would do lots of bad things.
We had tribal relations, and we had inter-tribe trade, we had inter-tribe war as well. We had social systems way before we had laws, way before we had institutions. I'm not saying institutions are bad, I'm not saying they don't work and they don't increase the utility and well-being of humans, or just creatures in general, right? But to assume that without a monarch or a
sovereign,
yeah. Yes, you would have absolute anarchy. It's just there's no precedent for this. Yes, there's a precedent for an increase of it, and yes, there is a precedent for increase in volatility and sort of just return to basis instincts. But the imposition that you don't have social order without law or without a sovereign is just
okay, I think there's a bit of an equivocation here.
Okay, please.
The fallacy of equivocation.
Yes, if there is,
right.
Please point it out.
Let me explain. When I say anarchy, I'm not using the term vernacularly.
Okay.
I'm not saying like, oh, it's chaos, like that.
No, you mean like a social system.
I'm talking about an ideology which is distinct from liberalism.
Sure.
And which has its own principles or lack thereof.
Absolutely.
Which is defined primarily as a lack of government.
Yes.
So anarchy cannot work in where there's a government. If there's a government and a sovereign, there's no anarchy.
There's no, yeah, it's
right.
That's not
anarchy. So the point is this: I'm saying that the anarchic system, in and of itself, you would assume that it would allow for more crime to take place because there's a lack of consequence, a fear of consequence.
Not necessarily.
You're saying not necessarily, but that's what the assumption is.
Because even if you don't have,
it's not necessary. You're right. It's not logically necessary.
It's not only that, but also we have examples of societies that have functioned without government or without the rule of law.
Papua New Guinea.
That have social structure that is not what you would call, mayhem or like, Sodom and Gomorrah, right? Yes, there's an increased proclivity because law by nature is a deterrent, right? It is, in fact, a limiting factor that is designed to increase utility. It doesn't always work. But the imposition that without the rule of law or a sovereign, you return to a not anarchical, but just a murderous state is not empirical.
Let me make this clear, all right? And just in a normal sense. You all went to school, right? Maybe you are still in school, right? I don't know. So let's say you're in the school, and you're a teacher, and I was a teacher for some time.
Sure.
And there were no rules in the classroom.
Sure.
Now, what do you assume will happen just use your brain. Do you think that the kids will be more behaved or less behaved?
Madness, chaos.
Right. Now, let's use that example with society. If there was no punishments in society, there's no prison. Prisons don't exist. Do you think that the crime will increase or decrease?
Look, man, you can't really use an example of children like someone who is literally at the minimum level of like capacity and awareness and experience in life, and then say, but what about society at large? Like,
okay, fine.
Yeah,
you don't like the example.
Yeah.
Let's use another example.
Sure, please.
A pub. You
pub, yes.
Yeah. I don't know if you go to.
Oh yeah.
Oh, you do, yeah. You don't look. You look quite. You have a high level of sobriety in this conversation, so I didn't assume that.
I tend to think that it stimulates my. I'm kidding.
No, it definitely doesn't. There's no evidence of that.
No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. Don't take that yet.
So here's what I'm saying. If you go to, and if there was no rules,
right?
Look, we know how the deal.
Sure.
In Arabic, we have a nice poetic saying. "Man amina al-uqubata asa al-adab." Whoever fears the consequences will get rude to you.
Right.
Yeah. Hobbes said, covenants are but words if they're not backed by swords. If there's no fear of consequence, then everything can go, everything can happen.
Not necessarily.
And let me tell you something. We're talking about sovereign consequences.
Sure.
If there's no sovereign consequence, you know what will happen? There will be some kind of, basically, let's be honest. If there's no sovereign, you mentioned it yourself, tribal systems, right? Tribal systems are basically, they become a pseudo-government.
Over time.
Yeah, right. So they become like, they're in charge now. They're basically the head of the tribe becomes like a parliamentarian. The guy with the biggest gun will have the last say. That's what will happen.
Look, whilst I absolutely agree that this is the sort of
you don't agree with this?
No. Listen, I absolutely agree. This is the sort of moral progression, or I wouldn't call it moral. That's a really wrong term. It's a judicial progression there, right? Like it usually tends towards this. However, this is not a necessary state because we do actually have examples of
like what? Sorry.
So, for instance, if you go to the Amazon doesn't, Amazon tribes don't always have a village elder. They have a village
They do,
elder
they do.
just because he's the oldest, but he's not a leader. He's just an advising figure.
Well, look, I can't tell you that I'm an expert on the Amazon rainforest.
Neither am I. No, I'm just.
I know some of my friends actually went to the Amazon rainforest. When I went to certain places in Africa where they have tribe leaders,
Right.
they're seen as the main men there, man. You know, they're seen as the main men. Like,
Okay, yeah.
usually it's men, you know, and except in very few circumstances. And they're the ones who call the shots. They're basically like parliamentarians. You don't want to get rude to them, basically.
Right.
Look, let me tell you something. If you go to certain areas in London or New York or wherever these places, the police have less say than the gangsters.
Oh yeah, I agree.
I mean, everyone knows this, right?
Yeah.
But why? What's the gangster got that the police doesn't? He's got secrets, people's secrets. He's got influence, and he's got guns and knives.